They shove me into the mud in front of the entire village, and everyone laughs. Not a few people, everyone. The blacksmith laughs, the miller's wife laughs. Even the dogs seem to be laughing, tails wagging like this is the best entertainment Hollow Creek has seen all year. And maybe it is, because the cursed farmer boy just got humiliated in front of the only noble family that matters, and nobody wants to miss it. I push myself up on my elbows, mud dripping off my chin, and I look up into the smug, perfect face of Cassian Vane, heir to Lord Edmund Vane. The kind of boy who's never once in his life had to wonder where his next meal was coming from. "Careful, farmhand," he says, loud enough for the whole square to hear. "Wouldn't want you to ruin your one good shirt." I don't have a good shirt. I have this one, and it's already ruined. That's the moment I decide something has to change. I just don't know yet how insane the change is about to be. My name is Wyn Thatcher, and 3 weeks ago my grandfather died in the middle of a thunderstorm, gripping my hand so hard it left bruises, whispering words that made no sense at the time. "The land remembers, Wyn. Plant the seed, let it grow." I thought it was fever talk. I thought grief was making an old man say strange things before the end. I was wrong. So wrong it's almost funny now. Hollow Creek is not a kind place if you're poor, orphaned, and bad at the one thing that's supposed to define a man's worth here, the trial of trades. Every boy in the village takes it at 16. You get sorted. Smith, soldier, merchant, scholar. Something with a future. I failed every single category except one. Farming. The lowest path. The path for people with no talent, no luck, and no family name worth protecting. So for 2 years, that's what I've been. The farmer boy. The joke. The kid everyone in the village uses as a measuring stick for how bad your life could theoretically get. But here's the part nobody knows yet. The part that's about to blow this entire village apart. The night my grandfather died, he pressed something small and cold into my palm. A token, carved from black wood, warm despite the storm outside, etched with symbols I didn't recognize. I shoved it in my pocket and forgot about it for 2 days. Too busy burying him, too busy fielding pity looks from people who wouldn't have spit on him while he was alive. Then on the third night, half asleep, half starving, staring at the cracked ceiling of the shack I inherited along with his debts, the token started to glow. I sat up so fast I hit my head on the low beam above my cot. Pain exploded behind my eyes, and when I opened them again, the whole room looked different. Not physically different, there was a layer over everything, like a sheet of glass with writing on it, numbers and outlines hovering over the walls, the floor, the crumbling hearth. Structure detected, dilapidated dwelling, condition 12%. Upgrade available. I froze. My heart was slamming so hard I could hear it in my ears. I said out loud, to an empty room, "What the hell?" Nothing answered, but when I reached out, almost as a joke, and touched the glowing outline hovering over a crack in the wall, something happened that I still can't fully explain. The crack sealed itself, not slowly, instantly. Like the wall had simply decided to remember what it looked like before it broke. That should have been the moment I ran outside screaming. Instead, I sat there for an hour, poking at glowing menus only I could see, testing every rule, until I understood the horrifying, beautiful truth. My grandfather hadn't left me a token. He'd left me a settlement core, a relic so old the village elders only mention it in half-forgotten stories about the founding families, the ones who built kingdoms out of nothing centuries ago. And somehow, impossibly, it had chosen me, the farmer boy, the joke. I didn't tell anyone. Of course I didn't. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, the dirt-poor orphan you all laugh at secretly has the power to build entire settlements out of thin air?" They'd either lock me up as a madman or, worse, they'd believe me, and then Lord Vane would take it from me the way he takes everything. So I did the only smart thing. I got to work in secret. The first thing I built was a well. Just a well, tucked behind the tree line on the edge of my dead grandfather's land, where nobody bothers to look. It took every scrap of grain I had stored. Every hour I wasn't pretending to be a useless farm boy in public, and when it finished, clean water bubbled up from ground that had been dry for a decade. I stood there at midnight, staring at it, laughing like an idiot, because it actually worked. That's when the first notification popped up that changed everything. Population event. A traveler has been drawn to your settlement. I didn't understand what that meant until 3 days later, when a starving, limping woman named Sarah stumbled out of the woods and collapsed at the edge of my land, saying she'd been walking for a week and something had pulled her here, like an instinct she couldn't explain. I should have been terrified. Instead, for the first time since my grandfather died, I felt something other than grief. I felt possibility. Sarah wasn't the only one. Over the next 10 days, 3 more travelers wandered out of the tree line, like something invisible had tugged them straight toward my hidden land. A limping fisherman named Odger, who'd lost his boat and his village to a flood upriver. A quiet young woman named Isolde, who never talked about where she came from, and I never pushed her to, and a pair of orphaned brothers barely old enough to hold a hoe steady. Every single one of them arrived hungry, exhausted, and completely unaware that they'd just walked into the middle of an experiment I barely understood myself. I remember standing at the edge of the well that first week, staring at the little cluster of people who now depended on me for food, shelter, and safety, and feeling something close to panic settle into my chest. Because the system didn't come with instructions, it didn't warn me how much grain a growing population would burn through, or how fast a single bad decision could unravel everything. Every notification felt like a new test I hadn't studied for. Resource warning: food reserves below sustainable threshold. That one nearly broke me. I spent 3 sleepless nights reworking every field boundary, unlocking a farming structure the Corps called a terraced plot, forcing myself to learn faster than I'd ever learned anything in my life, because the alternative was watching people who'd already lost everything once lose it again because of me. When the warning finally cleared, I sat down in the dirt and didn't move for a long time, hands shaking, chest aching with something between exhaustion and pride. Here's the part where things get complicated, though, because a girl at the market noticed I wasn't as pathetic as usual. Her name is Allara, the blacksmith's apprentice, sharp-tongued, sharper eyes, the kind of person who notices everything and says most of it out loud whether you want to hear it or not. She'd mocked me plenty over the years, mostly out of boredom, but lately she'd started watching me differently. Watching the way I walked with a little less shame, watching the calluses on my hands that weren't from farming tools anymore. "You're hiding something," she told me one afternoon, arms crossed, blocking my path at the market stalls like she owned the road. "I'm hiding my complete lack of interest in this conversation," I said. She didn't laugh, she just stared, like she was reading something written on my face I didn't know was there. "Fine, keep your secrets, farmhand, but I'm watching you." "Great, just great." The last thing I needed was the one person in this village sharp enough to actually catch me sneaking off to build an entire hidden settlement in the woods. I should have slowed down. Instead, I sped up. Within 2 weeks, my hidden land behind the tree line wasn't just a well and a shack anymore. It was 4 small houses, a storage barn, a training yard I built on instinct without even knowing why the system offered it. 12 people had wandered in from the roads, drawn by whatever pull the settlement core generates, each one bringing a skill, a trade, a reason to stay. A retired soldier named Barrick who'd lost his unit to a bandit ambush and hadn't spoken to anyone in months until I gave him a purpose again. A healer named Myrna who fled a burned village 2 counties over. A blacksmith's runaway son named Toby who couldn't have been older than 14 but worked like a man twice his size. And every single one of them looked at me like I was someone worth following. That feeling. That's the part that scared me most, because for 2 years, nobody in Hollow Creek had looked at me like I mattered. And now, in secret, in the dark, I had people calling me boss, without me ever asking for the title. Then the system dropped a notice I wasn't ready for. Threat detected. Bandit movement within 3 miles of settlement border. My stomach dropped through the floor. 12 people, no walls, no real defenses beyond a training yard and a retired soldier with a limp. I remember standing in the dark that night thinking, this is it. This is where the story ends before it even starts. Some group of raiders is going to wipe out the first real thing I've ever built, and nobody in Hollow Creek will even know it existed. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I stared at the glowing menus until dawn, testing every option the core allowed. And that's when I found it, a structure I hadn't unlocked before. A watchtower, requiring resources I barely had, requiring population numbers I barely met, but the system flagged it as urgent priority, in red glowing letters that made my chest tight with dread. I gave everything, every scrap of stored grain, every coin I'd hidden away, every hour of sleep. Barrick organized what little defense we could manage with sharpened stakes and a handful of borrowed tools. And 2 nights later, when 6 bandits crept toward the tree line expecting an easy, unguarded target, they found something they weren't prepared for. They found a watchtower with a lookout. They found stakes hidden in the brush. They found a dozen people who had nowhere left to run and everything left to protect, fighting like their lives depended on it. Because they did. We won. Barely. Bloodied, exhausted, terrified, but we won. And when the sun came up over a battered but standing settlement, something shifted in me permanently. This wasn't a secret hobby anymore. This was mine. These people were mine to protect. I remember sitting against the base of the watchtower afterward, hands still shaking, watching Barrick bandage a gash on Toby's arm, while Myrna moved between the wounded, with more calm than anyone that young should have to carry. Nobody said much. Nobody had to. We'd almost lost everything in one night, and somehow, impossibly, we hadn't. The system, of course, didn't care about my feelings. Right in the middle of my quiet moment of relief, a new notification flared up in front of my eyes, bright and completely unbothered by the fact that I just watched people bleed for the first time. Settlement milestone reached, defense successful, population loyalty increased, new structures unlocked. I almost laughed. Almost. Because apparently surviving a bandit raid with sharpened sticks and a retired soldier's stubbornness was exactly the kind of thing that impressed whatever ancient magic was running this thing. A palisade wall unlocked. A proper forge. Something called a meeting hall that the description simply labeled as a place for a settlement to become a community. I stared at that one for a long time. For the first time since my grandfather died, I let myself actually believe this could become something real. Not just a hiding place in the woods, not just a secret I was terrified of losing, a home, a future, something worth the risk. That should have been my victory moment. It wasn't. Because 3 days later, Allara followed me into the woods. I heard her before I saw her, a snapped branch, a muttered curse, and by the time I turned around she was already standing at the tree line with her jaw hanging open, staring past me at houses that shouldn't exist, at people who shouldn't be there, at a watchtower rising over trees that 2 months ago had nothing behind them but dirt and grief. "Wyn," she said slowly. "What did you do?" I had no choice but to tell her everything. The token, the core, the glowing menus only I could see. I braced myself for her to run, to scream, to report me straight to Lord Vane's men for the reward money that would absolutely change her life. Instead, she looked at the settlement, looked at me, and said the last thing I expected. "I want in." I should have said no. I should have told her it was too dangerous, that the fewer people who knew the safer everyone stayed, that dragging the blacksmith's apprentice into a secret this size was a good way to get both of us in trouble with people far more powerful than either of us. Instead, I heard myself say, "Fine. But you don't tell anyone. Not your father, not your friends, nobody." "Obviously," she said, rolling her eyes like I'd just insulted her intelligence. Then she looked past me at the watchtower again, at the people moving between houses that hadn't existed 2 months earlier, and something in her expression softened into pure, unfiltered awe. "You built all of this, by yourself, while everyone in that village was still laughing at you." "Not exactly by myself," I admitted, nodding toward Boric hauling lumber toward the palisade frame, toward Myrna teaching a young mother how to dress a wound properly. "But yeah, mostly." Allara turned out to be more useful than I expected, and not just because she knew things about metalwork that made the forge run twice as efficiently within a week. She had an eye for people, for spotting who could be trusted and who couldn't, for reading the tiny signs that separated an honest traveler from someone with darker intentions. More than once over the following weeks, her instincts caught something I would have missed entirely, and slowly, without either of us really discussing it, she became something closer to a partner in this than an outsider I'd reluctantly let in. That's when I realized this farmer boy nobody respected might actually be building something worth respecting. But of course, the moment things start going right, that's exactly when the universe decides to make them worse. Because word travels. Not fast, not obviously, but it travels. A few weeks later, one of the traders passing through Hollow Creek mentioned to the wrong person that crops were sprouting suspiciously fast on abandoned Thatcher land. And that trader happened to owe money to a man who happened to drink with one of Lord Vane's stewards. And that's how, On a gray morning I'll never forget, Lord Edmund Vane himself rode up to the edge of my grandfather's property with 20 armed men, his son Cassian smirking beside him like he already knew he'd won. "Interesting," Lord Vane said, surveying the land from his horse with cold, calculating eyes. "I was under the impression this parcel was worthless, abandoned, unproductive." He let the silence sit there, heavy and threatening. "Under the old decree, unproductive land defaults back to the noble house that oversees the territory. Did you know that, farmer boy?" I hadn't known that, and judging by the way his mouth curled up at the edges, he knew exactly what he was doing. My heart dropped through the floor. Everything I'd built, every person who trusted me, every wall and well and watchtower, gone, the second he decided to enforce that law. And there was nothing stopping him, nothing except whatever I could do in the next few seconds to change his mind. "It's not unproductive," I said, forcing my voice steady even though my hands were shaking. "Come see for yourself," Cassian laughed. "You're inviting us onto your pathetic little farm? This should be entertaining." It should have been the worst decision I ever made, letting the man who could legally seize everything walk straight through the middle of it. Instead, it became the moment everything changed. Because when Lord Vane crossed the tree line and saw what was actually behind it, the houses, the well, the training yard, the watchtower standing tall against the morning sky, 20 people going about their work like this was a real, thriving community instead of some pathetic patch of dirt. His cold expression cracked for just a second into something that looked almost like shock. "This," he said slowly, "is not what I was told existed here." "No," I said, standing a little taller than I ever had in front of him before. "It's not." He walked the length of the training yard without asking permission, boots crunching over ground that had been dead dirt a month ago, and I watched him take in every detail with the calculating eyes of a man who'd spent his whole life measuring the value of things. He paused at the well, ran a gloved hand along the stonework like he was checking for some hidden trick. He studied the palisade line still under construction at the settlement's edge, and for just a moment, something flickered across his face that almost looked like respect, buried under decades of practiced contempt for anyone born beneath him. 20 residents, he said, more to himself than to me, doing that math again behind cold, calculating eyes. Functioning agriculture, basic fortifications, in under 2 months. He turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I'd known of him, Lord Edmund Vane looked at me like I was something other than dirt beneath his boots. "Tell me, farmer boy, where exactly did an orphan with no coin and no trade learn to build something like this?" I wasn't about to tell him the truth. Not the real truth, not the token, not the glowing menus only I could see. "My grandfather taught me more than anyone gave him credit for," I said instead, which wasn't exactly a lie. Cassian's smug grin had completely disappeared. He was staring at the settlement like it physically offended him. Like the idea that the farmer boy he'd humiliated in the mud a month ago had quietly built something this real was an insult he couldn't process. Lord Vane, though, was more dangerous than his son because he wasn't reacting with anger. He was reacting with calculation. I could see him doing math behind his eyes, counting houses, counting workers, counting exactly how valuable this land had suddenly become now that it wasn't worthless anymore. "Under the decree," he said carefully, "developed land with an active population cannot be seized without formal challenge before the regional magistrate." He paused, studying me like I was a puzzle he hadn't expected to find interesting. "Which means, farmer boy, you've just made yourself very inconvenient." That should have been a relief. It wasn't. Because inconvenient, to a man like Vane, is just another word for target. He left that day without seizing anything, but the threat hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Cassian, humiliated in front of his own men by a farmer boy's settlement, wasn't the type to let that go quietly. Within a week, rumors started spreading through Hollow Creek. Twisted, ugly rumors about how the Thatcher land wasn't earned honestly, how something unnatural was happening out there, how the boy who'd failed the trial of trades was clearly hiding something dark enough to warrant fear instead of curiosity. I watched my own neighbors start looking at me differently. Not the mocking laughter from before. Something colder, something closer to suspicion. Allara found me sitting on the edge of the watchtower platform one night, staring out at the settlement she'd only recently sworn herself to. "You look like someone about to do something stupid," she said, climbing up to sit beside me. I'm thinking about doing something very stupid, I admitted. Good, she said. Those are usually the ones worth doing. I told her my plan. Not to hide anymore, not to wait for Vane to find another loophole, another decree, another excuse to take everything I'd built. Instead, to make it impossible to hide. To make Hollow Creek see exactly what the farmer boy had built with his own 2 hands, before Vane could twist the story into something ugly and unrecognizable first. It was reckless. It was terrifying. And 3 days later, I did it anyway. I invited the entire village. Not officially, not through any formal announcement, because that would have given Vane time to interfere. Instead, I simply let Sarah and Barrick and Myrna spread word quietly through the market, an open invitation to see what was really happening on Thatcher land. Framed as harmless curiosity, framed as nothing more than neighbors checking on neighbors. By the time word reached Vane's steward, half the village was already walking down the path toward the tree line, drawn by curiosity too strong to resist after weeks of rumors. What they found stopped every single one of them in their tracks. A real, functioning settlement. Fields greener and more productive than anything else in the region. A well providing clean water to 20 grateful residents. Children, actual children who'd arrived with desperate, displaced families, playing safely within sight of a watchtower built to protect them. And standing in the middle of it, not the joke, not the cursed farmer boy, but someone who had built all of this with nothing but a dead man's gift and a refusal to give up. Old Marta, the miller's wife, the same woman who'd laughed loudest when I was shoved into the mud, stood frozen at the edge of it all, with tears in her eyes. "This is real," she whispered, like she couldn't quite believe it even while staring straight at it. "It's real," I said. One by one, people who'd spent 2 years treating me like the village punchline started drifting through the settlement in stunned silence. A farmer who'd once refused to sell me seed grain on credit stared at rows of crops healthier than his own. A boy who used to throw rocks at my fence as a joke stood wide-eyed at the base of the watchtower, craning his neck up at a structure taller than anything else in the region except the manor house itself. Even the village elder, a stooped old man who rarely left his chair by the fire these days, had made the walk down, leaning on his cane, muttering something about how he hadn't seen land like this since before the last famine took half the county with it. Sarah found me in the middle of the crowd and pressed a cup of well water into my hands, grinning like she couldn't quite believe how far we'd come either. "Half these people wouldn't have spit on you a season ago," she murmured. "Funny how fast that changes when you stop needing them to." She wasn't wrong. But the strange thing was, standing there watching Marta wipe tears from her eyes, watching children from the village play with children from my settlement like the divide between us and them had simply dissolved on contact, I didn't feel triumphant so much as I felt something quieter. Something closer to relief. Like a weight I'd been carrying since the day my parents died had finally started to lift. That's when Cassian arrived, furious, red-faced, flanked by 2 of his father's men, clearly having been warned too late to stop the village from seeing the truth with their own eyes. "This changes nothing," he snapped, loud enough for the crowd to hear, desperate to reclaim some kind of control over a situation that had already slipped completely out of his hands. "This land is still under dispute. My father will—" "Your father already saw it," I said, cutting him off in front of everyone. "He already knows the decree doesn't apply anymore. You're not here to enforce a law, Cassian. You're here because you can't stand that the farmer boy built something better than anything your family's ever given this village." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I've ever heard. Cassian's face went through about 6 different colors before he finally turned and stormed off, dragging his humiliated men with him, muttering threats under his breath that I chose not to hear, because in that moment, for the first time in my life, his threats didn't feel like they had power over me anymore. The crowd behind me, the same crowd that had laughed while I sat in the mud a month earlier, erupted into something I never expected to hear directed at me. Applause. I stood there in the middle of my own settlement, surrounded by people I'd built a life alongside in secret, watching an entire village that had spent 2 years treating me like a joke slowly, painfully, realize exactly how wrong they'd been. That night, after the crowd finally thinned out and the last curious villager wandered back toward Hollow Creek still shaking their head in disbelief, my settlement did something it had never done before. It celebrated. Barrick broke out a cask of something strong he'd been hiding for exactly this occasion. Myrna got half the children to sleep with a song I didn't recognize but somehow already loved. Allara sat beside me on the edge of the well, shoulder against mine, watching firelight flicker across houses that hadn't existed 2 months earlier. "You did it," she said quietly. "The joke nobody respected, just outbuilt a lord's entire family estate." "We did it," I corrected her, and for once she didn't argue. For a few hours that night, I let myself believe the hardest part was finally behind me. I let myself believe that surviving Vane's greed and surviving the village's cruelty meant the story was somehow finished, that whatever came next would simply be the slow, satisfying work of watching something I'd built keep growing under a sky that no longer felt like it was working against me. It should have felt like the end of the story, the triumphant final moment where the underdog wins and everyone lives happily ever after. It wasn't, because 2 days later, a royal envoy rode into Hollow Creek carrying the crest of the crown itself, and the first words out of his mouth made my blood run cold. "I'm looking," he said, dismounting slowly in front of the entire gathered crowd, "for the boy who built a settlement out of nothing in 3 weeks. The crown has some very serious questions for him." The whole square went dead silent. Villagers who'd been celebrating my victory over Vane just 2 days earlier now stared at me with a completely different kind of fear in their eyes, the kind reserved for anyone who's just become interesting to the people who run the kingdom. Alara's hand found mine without either of us saying a word, gripping tight enough to hurt. I stepped forward anyway, because hiding now would only make it worse, and because whatever came next, I wasn't going to let this village watch me run. "I'm Wyn Thatcher," I said, and my voice barely shook at all. "What does the crown want with a farmer?" The envoy's eyes swept over me, over the crowd, over the tree line behind Hollow Creek, where he clearly already knew something impossible was hiding. A thin, unreadable smile crossed his face. "That," he said, "depends entirely on what you show me next." And that's when I understood, standing there with my hard-won victory barely a day old, that surviving Lord Vane was never going to be the hard part. The hard part was just getting started. The envoy's smile didn't move. Neither did I. "Depends on what you show me next," he'd said, and the words sat in the air of the square like a blade someone had set down but hadn't decided to pick back up yet. 20 feet away, Alara's fingers were still locked around mine, tight enough that I could feel my pulse in her grip instead of my own chest. "My name's Corin Aldrich," the envoy said, finally straightening from his half-bow to the crowd, brushing road dust off a coat that cost more than every building in Hollow Creek combined. "Magistrate, attached to the Crown's Office of Territorial Registry." He said it like a man reciting a title he'd said 1,000 times, bored with the shape of it in his own mouth. "And you, Wyn Thatcher, are the reason I rode 4 days through bad weather instead of finishing paperwork in a warm office." "I didn't ask you to come," I said. "It came out steadier than I felt." "No," he agreed. "Nobody ever does." He looked past me then, toward the tree line, toward the place where a watchtower stood over trees that 2 months ago had covered nothing but dirt and grief. Something flickered in his eyes that wasn't quite the cold calculation I'd seen in Lord Vane. It was worse. It was interest. "Do you know what a settlement surge is, Mr. Thatcher?" I didn't. And the way he asked it, slow, deliberate, like he already knew my answer would tell him everything he needed, that scared me more than Vane's 20 armed men ever had. "I'm going to guess no," Aldrich said, when I didn't answer fast enough. "Let me explain it to you the way it was explained to me 3 days ago, in a report that made my supervisor very unhappy. Every settlement in this kingdom leaves a signature, a resonance in the land itself, faint, slow, the kind of thing that takes decades to register on any instrument sensitive enough to notice." He paused. "Yours registered in under 2 months. And it didn't just register, it spiked. Hard enough that a monitoring relay 3 counties away flagged it as a possible threat before anyone bothered checking what it actually was." The crowd around us had gone dead silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on your shoulders. Marta was still there, tears from an hour ago barely dry on her face, now replaced by something closer to fear. Old villagers who'd applauded me 20 minutes earlier were suddenly very interested in studying their own boots. "That's impossible," I said, because it was the only thing I could think to say that wasn't a confession. "It's not impossible," Aldrich said. "It's rare. There's a difference." He stepped closer, and up close, I could see the exhaustion under his eyes, the kind that comes from riding hard and thinking harder. Rare enough that in the entire recorded history of this kingdom, there have only been a handful of relics capable of producing a signature like the one sitting behind you in those trees. And the last person confirmed to possess one of them vanished from the capital 26 years ago. Nobody's seen a trace of that signature since. Until 3 weeks ago. 26 years. That number landed somewhere in my chest and sat there, heavy, wrong. My grandfather had come to Hollow Creek with nothing, everyone always said. A stranger who bought a broken-down farm and never talked about where he'd come from. 26 years was close enough to be a coincidence. It was also close enough to not be one. I didn't say any of that out loud. Allara's hand tightened again. A warning, a reminder. Don't give him anything he doesn't already have. So, Aldrich said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been cruel. I'm going to need you to show me, not tell me, show me, right here, in front of these witnesses, so I can write an honest report instead of a guess. My stomach dropped clean through the floor of the world. Show him, in front of the entire village. In front of the men Lord Vane had left watching from the edge of the square, the ones who'd report every word back to Cassian by nightfall. In front of everyone who'd just spent an afternoon deciding I wasn't the joke anymore, about to watch exactly how much bigger this secret actually was. And if I say no, I asked. Aldrich's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Then I go back to the capital and file a report saying an unregistered settlement of unknown scale, holding a relic of unknown origin, refused a lawful inspection by the Crown's registry. And within a month, you'll have soldiers here instead of magistrates. Soldiers don't ask politely. He let that sit. I'm not your enemy, Mr. Thatcher. I'm the version of this conversation where you still get to walk away standing up. Great. Just great. The one time I actually wanted a villain I could punch, and instead I got a bureaucrat with better odds than a war. I looked at Allara. She looked back at me, and I watched her make the same calculation I was making, watched her land in the same impossible place. There wasn't a version of this where I said no and everything stayed fine. There had never been a version of this where everything stayed fine, not since the night a dead man's token started glowing on a cracked ceiling. Fine, I said, but not the whole thing. A fraction. Enough to prove I'm not lying. Not enough to hand you a blueprint. Something that might have been respect crossed Aldrich's face. That's a reasonable term. I can work with reasonable. I led him through the tree line myself, the crowd trailing behind at a careful distance, murmurs rising and falling like wind through dry grass. Barrack fell into step beside me without a word, close enough to put himself between me and trouble if trouble decided to show up early. Allara walked on my other side, chin up, daring anyone in that crowd to say a single thing about it. The settlement looked different seen through a stranger's eyes for the first time. I'd stopped noticing how impossible it was, the way you stop noticing your own house. But watching Aldrich's gaze move across the palisade line, the watchtower, the neat rows of houses that shouldn't exist on land this poor, I saw it again the way he did. 20 people had built a life here in under 2 months. That shouldn't be possible. It wasn't possible. Except it was, standing right in front of him, breathing and cooking supper, and laughing at something one of the orphaned brothers had said near the well. Show me, Aldrich said again. Quieter this time, like even he understood we'd crossed into something that deserved a different tone. I walked to the edge of the training yard, to a patch of bare ground I'd left open on purpose weeks ago, never quite sure why, some instinct telling me I'd need clear space eventually. I reached out and touched the air the way I'd touched it 100 times before, feeling for the familiar hum of the core's presence in my chest, the glowing menus only I could see rising up like heat off summer stone. Structure available, watch post. Cost, moderate. Build time, instant. I chose the smallest thing the system offered. Nothing that would show scale, nothing that would show speed, just enough. The ground shuddered, low and quiet, more felt than heard. And then, in the space of 3 heartbeats, a small wooden watch post rose out of bare dirt, planks sliding into place like the earth itself was remembering something it had always known how to do. Timber knitting together seamlessly, no nails, no scaffolding, no builders. It stood there when it was done, simple and small and utterly impossible. The crowd behind me made a sound I'd never heard a group of people make before. Not a gasp, something quieter and more frightened than that. Aldrich didn't gasp. He went very still, The way a man goes still when he's just confirmed the worst thing he suspected was true. He walked forward slowly, ran a gloved hand along the fresh timber the way Lord Vane had run his hand along the well weeks earlier, except Aldrich wasn't checking for a trick. He already knew there wasn't one. "Settlement core," he said, so quietly I almost didn't catch it. "Full manifestation, not a fragment, not a lesser relic." He turned to look at me, and for the first time since he'd arrived, there was something almost like fear behind his professional calm. "Do you have any idea what you're holding, Mr. Thatcher?" "A little," I said. "I've had 2 months to figure some of it out." 2 months, he repeated, and laughed once, short and humorless. "It took the last known bearer of a core like this 11 years to build what you've built in 2 months. 11 years, and even then he never let it show past a single fortified estate." He shook his head slowly. "You didn't just build a settlement, you built one faster than anyone in recorded history, on land that had nothing, with resources that shouldn't have been enough." "Is that a compliment or a threat?" Allara asked, stepping forward before I could stop her, arms crossed, chin up, giving him the exact same look she'd once given me across a market stall when she decided I was hiding something worth knowing. Aldrich studied her for a long moment. "Depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes," he said. "Who are you to him?" "Someone who's known him since we were children," Allara said, without a shred of hesitation in her voice. "Someone who watched this village throw him in the mud a month ago and laugh while they did it. Someone who watched him build all of this in secret with nothing but grief and stubbornness while every single one of them called him worthless." Her voice sharpened, cutting through the murmuring crowd behind us like a blade through cloth. "He's not some dangerous relic hoarder plotting against the crown. He's a boy who lost everyone he had left and decided to build something instead of falling apart. If you're here to see a monster, you're looking in the wrong direction." The silence that followed felt different from the one before. Heavier, but not the same kind of heavy. Aldrich looked at her for a long beat, then at me, something recalculating behind his eyes. "Character testimony from a lifelong acquaintance," he said slowly, more to himself than to either of us, like he was drafting the report already. "Noted." He almost smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You're fortunate to have someone willing to say that in front of a crown official, Mr. Thatcher. Loyalty like that isn't common." "I know," I said, and meant it more than I'd meant almost anything else that day. Aldrich turned in a slow circle, taking in the whole settlement again, the wall under construction, the smoke rising from Myrna's healing hut, the sound of children laughing somewhere near the well that hadn't existed on this land a season ago. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, less official, more tired. "I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it clearly, because the way you respond to this in the next 30 seconds will decide a great deal about what happens to everyone standing behind you." He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear it. This stopped being a local matter the second that watchpost came out of the ground in front of me. Lord Vane was a problem you could outmaneuver with cleverness and a well-timed audience. The crown is not Lord Vane, and there are people above me, people you have never heard of, people who have spent decades hunting for exactly this kind of signature, who are going to hear about what happened here whether I want them to or not. My mouth went dry. "What people?" "People who remember the last time a relic like yours surfaced," he said, "and what it cost to make it disappear again." Barak's hand landed on my shoulder, steady, grounding, the kind of touch that said I'm here without needing words for it. Alara's jaw tightened beside me, and I could see her running the same math I was running. This was bigger than a bandit raid, bigger than a lord's greed, bigger than anything the two of us had braced ourselves to survive. "So what happens now?" I asked, and I hated how small my voice sounded compared to how big the question was. "Now," Aldrich said, straightening, official mask sliding back into place like a door closing, "I file my report. Honestly, which is more than most magistrates would offer you, given what I just watched a farm boy pull out of bare ground in 3 heartbeats. I'll recommend observation rather than seizure. That buys you time. Weeks, maybe a couple of months, before someone with far more authority than me decides to take a personal interest." He paused, studying me one more time, like he was trying to memorize something he suspected he'd need to remember later. "Use that time wisely, Mr. Thatcher, because right now, this settlement is the most interesting thing to happen in this kingdom in 26 years. And interesting things attract exactly the kind of attention that gets people buried." 26 years? There it was again, that number, sitting in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow or spit out. You keep saying 26 years like it means something specific, I said, forcing the words out before I could talk myself out of them. Like you already know something about it you haven't told me. Something shifted in Aldrich's expression. For the first time since he'd ridden into the square, he looked almost reluctant, the way a man looks when he's about to hand someone a weight he knows they aren't ready to carry. Your grandfather, he said. Thatcher. That was his name, wasn't it? The old man who bought this land 2 decades ago, kept to himself, never spoke about where he'd come from. The world went very quiet around me. Even the wind through the trees seemed to hold still, waiting. How do you know about my grandfather? I asked, and my voice had gone somewhere strange and cold, somewhere I didn't recognize. Aldrich reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper worn soft at the creases, from being handled too many times, the way official documents get handled when someone keeps returning to them, unable to leave a question alone. He didn't open it, he just held it, weighing it in his hand like it was heavier than paper had any right to be. Before I left the capital, I pulled every record even remotely connected to unregistered core signatures over the last 30 years, he said. Most of it was nothing. Rumors, false alarms, superstitious farmers mistaking lightning for magic. He tapped the folded paper once, twice, against his palm. But one file wasn't nothing. One file was a name flagged by the Royal Registry 26 years ago as a person of significant interest, a man who vanished from the capital in the middle of the night, along with a relic the crown had spent years trying to convince him to surrender willingly. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. That doesn't have to be him. It's not a common name, Mr. Thatcher, Aldrich said, gently now, like he understood exactly how much this was about to cost me, and hated that he was the one delivering it. It's the same name, same trade, if the old records are accurate, same skill set the crown was so desperate to keep in the capital that they placed him under formal observation for years before he disappeared. He finally unfolded the paper, just enough to show me a line of old, faded handwriting, a name I would have recognized anywhere, in any handwriting, on any piece of paper in the world. Thatcher. Your grandfather, Aldrich said quietly, was on a royal watch list decades ago for possessing a relic exactly like this one. And then one night, he simply vanished, and nobody in the capital ever found him again. Until now. Until you. He folded the paper back up slowly, tucked it into his coat, and looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite suspicion. Something caught uncomfortably between the two. Do you know why he ran?